I've been so looking forward to a conversation with conductor Kellen Gray. He's here on Classical Conversations to tell us about a new album of African American voices and music recorded by the Royal Scottish National Orchestra. So, welcome on, Kellen. How are you doing?
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm doing really, really wonderfully, and I'm just really excited to sit down and chat a bit.
We're excited to have you. And I want to dive right into some of the details of the album. But first, I feel like I should note this is not your first album of African American voices and music, right? There was one that came out before this one.
Correct. Yeah, yeah. We had an album that released around the same time in 2022, October 2022, for UK Black History Month, and that featured works by William Dawson, George Walker, and William Grant Still. The thrust behind that one was starting from the very beginning. The two first published symphonies by African American composers in William Dawson's Negro Folk Symphony and William Grant Still's Afro American Symphony, composed around the same time and published around the same time, and then also commemorating the 100th birthday of George Walker, which happened to be released in that year as well. So it was very timely to produce that album at that time, and it was just felt really lucky to do that project and sort of start from the beginning and really, how do I say this, re-record these works from the perspective of an African American conductor who's been raised in the culture from which the folk music of these symphonies was made, and with a major orchestra, the first time the combination of those two have come together, and really, really thankful for the RSNO and Linn Records for doing so.
Yeah, great. Well, I feel like that gets us kind of caught up to speed to now the second album. Can you tell us about what we can expect from the new one?
Sure, sure. In African American Voices too, we take just a little bit of a left turn from just the foundational two symphonies, again, in the Dawson Negro Folk Symphony and the William Grant Still Afro American Symphony, who are two symphonies that one could say there's an aesthetic similarity between them. And for the uninitiated, you might assume that there's an aesthetic similarity between all African American composers. And so with the second album, we decided to take a different direction and try to show more of the diversity within this particular subsection of classical music, and works by Margaret Bonds, Ulysses Kay, and Coleridge Taylor Perkinson. Three composers that have some overlap between them as far as their lifetime, and have sort of a linear relationship to the composers of the previous album, but their voices sound very, very different. You have Ulysses Kay and Margaret Bonds, who were born in the first quarter of the 20th century. I want to say both of them were in the 19 teens or so. But Margaret Bonds' work centers a lot around the civil rights movement, and particularly this particular piece, the Montgomery Variations. It's seven movements of theme and variation, or what she calls seven ruminations on the spiritual I want Jesus to walk with me. And it basically outlines the narrative from the decision to peacefully protest all the way through a peaceful march by the time we get to the benediction, inspired by the 1963 Montgomery bus boycotts and the Birmingham church bombing.
Those Montgomery variations, I think I read somewhere, maybe in the program notes, that it was the score for it was lost for a time. Is that right?
Yes.
When did we find that?
I want to say the score was rediscovered around 2017, so it was only just a few years ago that it was rediscovered, and it was featured in the Minnesota Orchestra's Listen project, which I have a keen familiarity with, not just through the Minnesota Orchestra, but also working through the African Diasporic Music Project. My colleagues here have been sort of rediscovering and finding works and cataloging them by African American composers. And I'm so grateful to my colleagues, Louise Toppin and James Blatchley, who I work with closely in that project. She being the founder and myself being an assistant editor of the project, of trying to highlight works by African American composers, and Margaret Bonds is one that we all champion.
Yeah. So this being such a recent find, are there other recordings out there, or is this one of the first ones?
This is the first commercial recording. The only other that exists is the recording on YouTube from the Minnesota Orchestra's Listen project, but ours would be the very first recording or commercial recording of this one. And also same for the Ulysses Kay Concerto for Orchestra and the Coleridge Taylor Perkinson Worship a Concert Overture.
That's great to know. And the Coleridge Taylor Perkinson, I wanted to note not to be confused with some other similar names, right? There's a Samuel Coleridge Taylor and a Samuel Taylor Coleridge. But this is somebody different, right? Coleridge Taylor Perkinson. Tell us a little bit more about his life and music.
Yeah, Coleridge Taylor Perkinson, yes, of course, named after Samuel Coleridge Taylor, the British composer, who ironically was incredibly inspired by the pursuit of freedom and civil rights in the United States. So much of his work and inspiration comes from the writing of W.E.B. Du Bois. So it's sort of a cyclical, I guess is the word I'm looking for, theme between those two gentlemen in their lives. But Coleridge Taylor Perkinson is a really, really unique composer. He's one of my absolute favorites and ones that I'm most fascinated by, and that he has such a unique musical style and musical language. He writes in very much a modern and tonal language, but he's also a neoclassicist and also equal parts jazz musician as he is classical composer. So you find this sort of Venn diagram of those three corners meeting together between classical music, 20th century classical music, jazz, and early Baroque music. And I think you find that in his worship, the concert overture. It's he uses the Christian doxology as the theme for the piece, and literally as the slow section, much like any other overture. There's a sort of a slow section and then a fast section. And in the slow section, he uses this sort of mixed meter asymmetrical variations of the doxology and moves us into an allegro section, which has some variation on the original theme also, but mostly features this almost jazz and bebop like feel between African drums and really, really fast notes from various parts of the orchestra, particularly the violin section. So I think you'll find an almost scat quality to some of these faster notes, but at the same time, it holds its classical foundation. It's just a really, really unique tonal language. So I recommend hearing, obviously, his worship, the concert overture, but also his sinfoniettas and the chamber music. He's just such a unique composer.
And what about the Ulysses Kay concerto? What is it about that concerto that inspired you or made you want to include it on this album?
I think just he's another incredibly unique composer. His concept of color is unbelievable. Again, looking to this album to try to create a much more diverse array of voices. Ulysses Kay is a composer who's easily neglected considering the time in which he lived. So again, he was born in the 19 teens. The sort of height of his compositional powers would have been in the times that both Aaron Copland and George Gershwin were most popular. This is also a time in which, in classical music, at least in the U.S., we call this the breaking of tonality. Most composers, aside from composers like Copland and Gershwin, were writing in atonality, and that was sort of the in vogue moment of the time. And so, basically, if you weren't one of those two gentlemen and you were writing tonal pieces, you were very much ignored. So, despite the fact that Ulysses Kay won all sorts of different compositional awards and through basically the quality of his pieces, you can tell that he's quite the incredible composer. But he was both ignored in his time for his aesthetic of writing and then also being an African American composer. But I think when you listen to his work, you'll find not only just beautiful, beautiful colors, but also a mastery of form. He also was a neoclassicist. So in fact, in this concerto for orchestra, not too different from the Bartok concerto for orchestra, sort of following up in that genre. He starts the first movement with a toccata, the second movement's an ario, and then finishes up in the third movement, Passacaglia, sort of refreshing those early music forms that were 21st century language.
I know it hasn't been very long since the debut of the second album of African American Voices in Music, but have you had any audience responses yet?
Yes, quite a bit. In fact, I love getting texts every now and then that someone hears this album on Sirius XM radio or on Spotify, and it's been nothing but positive. I think probably the thing that's been not necessarily the most surprising, but I'd say the most refreshing is that almost all the comments have been about how much people love the music, or I should say, it's more they loved it more than they thought they would. And so just to be able to bring some highlight to Margaret Bonds, Ulysses Kay, and Coleridge Taylor Perkinson, that these are voices that we should hear more often, it's just very, very gratifying.
I'm thinking about how each recording is so uniquely sculpted by the individual conductor and orchestra. So maybe this is a good time to learn a little bit more about you. You're originally from South Carolina?
Yes, yes, originally from Rock Hill, South Carolina. And I didn't necessarily grow up in a musical family like a lot of classical musicians or like conductors, but music was sort of always around. In fact, most of my musical origins come from folk music. So whether it was singing in the church choir or in the backyard and just singing whatever folk songs of the area or stomping and clapping, I mean, literally being surrounded by gospel and jubas and oh gosh, um, let's see, Appalachian folk music. At the same time, getting in the car and hearing Barry White, and Al Green, and hip hop and Barry Manilow. I was just surrounded by music all the time. And so, much like Coleridge Taylor Perkinson, frankly, of being sort of this collage of many musical styles all at once. Um, and I was really lucky to basically have a family that wanted to sort of nurture that and allowed me my space to sort of just rummage through my parents' record collection and didn't really stifle me from playing music really loud around the house every now and then. Luckily, it was music that they liked. But I did eventually learn to play the violin in the public school system of Rock Hill, South Carolina. I started from, I believe, the seventh grade or so. And then by the time I was in high school, a gentleman moved to town that actually taught violin privately. And so I started with him for a few years and eventually reconnected, or my father reconnected me with one of his college professors, Mr. Leroy Sellers, who was actually one of the violinists that integrated the Charlotte Symphony back in the 60s. And so he became a violin teacher and taught me and had me practicing at 5 a.m. Before school every morning. At this point, like literally quit all my sports endeavors to focus on violin so I could get into school, and that's what got me on my way to get a violin degree. But yeah, I would say I really, really have to credit the many folk styles of South Carolina for sort of my musical origins, and that's really fed into this album quite a bit. As I mentioned earlier, um, this is the first time that the combination of a black conductor, an African American conductor, and a major orchestra has recorded these works, and the same for the first album. And it's specifically the folk music of African American culture that almost all of these pieces are based on. And so it's just a really, I'd say, neat alignment that my sort of musical history is so connected to this music, and I have an orchestra that is so willing to take on projects like these.
What are some of the memorable moments that you had in rehearsals with the Royal Scottish National Orchestra in this process?
I guess over the past 2 years in doing this, most of the memorable moments are seeing the sort of light bulb go off within the orchestra, or making the connection from the original source material to where we are now. For example, trying to really, really capture both the spirit and the feel, and then also obviously the accuracy of a particular passage in the William Grant Still Afro-American Symphony, and the sound just wasn't quite there that we needed. And it eventually came to me the only way to really sort of capture this is to actually sing it, and probably embarrass myself just a little bit. Sing it exactly the way we would have sang it in church when I was at home. So um, luckily, this passage is very similar to a spiritual that I would have grown up with. So I just sang the spiritual in its original setting to the orchestra. And then also to try to give them more of a sense of the texture, I hummed it because that's often also something that would have happened in the service is that the minister would have said, hum one verse. And so very much this sonority is similar to a congregation humming this particular spiritual in a certain way. And so it really helped give them a sense of the actual color and texture we were looking for. And you could sort of see them, oh, the light bulb goes off, and they were able to imitate that in a way that I probably wouldn't have been able to do without me actually sort of putting myself out there just a little bit. And the same for the Margaret Bonds. Many of the trying to replicate some of the not necessarily Juba sections, but the sections that are reminiscent of gullah rhythms. Luckily, my time in the Low Country in Charleston, South Carolina, as well has me very familiar with Jubas and field hollers, ring shouts. Again, Southern and particularly African American Southern folk music, and sort of demonstrating exactly what a juba would be and how it should be performed, and giving them a sense of the feel of the rhythm. And luckily, I think that really came across in the actual performance.
I wish I could have been a fly on the wall for rehearsals because that sounds like a really beautiful way to internalize the music and relate and connect to it. Is there anything else that you would like to add before we go, or you'd like our listeners to know about the second volume of African American Voices?
I guess I would just encourage our listeners to really look into the lives, works of Margaret Bonds, Ulysses Kay, and Coleridge Taylor Perkinson, and for that matter, William Dawson and William Grant Still and George Walker as well. I mean, they're really, really not just interesting musicians and composers, but really interesting people. And I think as classical music fans, we spend so much of our lives delving into the depths of Beethoven's life and Tchaikovsky and Mozart and figuring out how their life influenced the music and becoming more acquainted with the pieces that we don't know by them. And I think the same can be done for these composers, and not just because they're African American composers and therefore received a sort of marginalization in their lifetime where their works weren't played as often. But I think that the things that they went through in their life really informed the music to a certain degree, and particularly gives you a window not just into the culture, but into how the music can be influenced by the culture and vice versa. And so I just might encourage you to look a little deeper into their compositions and also read a bit more of their biographies and maybe look into the African Diasporic Music Project to find more works that you might not have heard of.
With that, we will leave our listeners to enjoy the album again, African American Voices Volume 2, conducted by Kellen Gray. I've been speaking with Kellen here on Classical Conversation. So thank you so much, Kellen, for your time and your comments.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I hope you do it again sometime.